adventures and travels led him to Jerusalem. There, the Jewish leaders brought up false charges against him, and Paul was taken prisoner and sent to Caesarea to stand trial before King Agrippa. Although King Agrippa found that Paul had committed no crime, because he was a Roman citizen and had appealed to the Roman emperor, Paul was sent to Rome. Under the watchful eyes of Julius, a Roman officer, Paul and a number of other prisoners boarded a large sailing ship that would carry them to many port cities on the long journey to Rome. Once aboard the ship, Paul was led on a winding journey that took him from Caesarea to Sidon to Myra to Cnidus, and then around the island of Crete, where they docked at a place called Fair Havens. Getting to Fair Havens had been a long and difficult journey. Winter was approaching, bringing with it dangerous weather and sailing conditions. Paul pleaded with the sailors and officers to stay on Crete. Paul warned them, "Continuing this journey will bring disaster to our ship, cargo, and our own lives. We should remain here." Despite Paul's warnings, the officer in charge was persuaded by the ship's captain to find a safer place on the island of Crete where they could spend the winter. Soon after they set sail, what was a gentle breeze turned into hurricane-force winds that blew their ship far off course and out into the open sea. The sailors tried to control the ship, but nothing they did could put them back on course. Exhausted, the sailors secured the ship as best as they could with ropes, and then let the storm drive them wherever it pleased. For many days, the ship sailed on raging seas under the black skies of the storm that blotted out the sun and the stars. Exhausted and starving, everyone on board began to lose hope that they would survive this voyage. All except for Paul. Paul stood in front of the crew and passengers and said, "Men, you should have listened to me and not left Crete. But take courage. God's angel came to me last night and said that the ship will be destroyed, but all of us will survive. Even though we will be shipwrecked, God will save us." Finally, after 14 nights of fear and misery, the sailors sensed that the ship was approaching land. By measuring the water's depth, the sailors were able to tell that they were getting closer. They dropped the ship's anchors, hoping that they would stop before crashing against the rocks. Some of the terrified sailors couldn't wait to get off the ship and onto dry land, so they lowered the lifeboat to the water while pretending to lower anchors. Paul told a Roman officer what was happening and warned, "Unless we all stay on this boat, you won't survive." Hearing this, the officer cut the lifeboat loose, and it fell away. Before the sun came up the next day, Paul urged everyone to eat, so they would have strength to survive the events that would take place that day. Everyone on board knew that their voyage would end with a shipwreck. Paul could see the fear and concern on their faces, so he offered them encouragement by reminding them that God said everyone on the ship would make it safely to shore. Paul then took some bread and gave thanks to God in front of the crew and passengers. He broke it into pieces and then began to eat. Everyone on board ate until they were full, and they were strengthened and encouraged. At daylight, the sailors decided to run the ship aground. They cut away the anchors and aimed the ship for the beach. The ship slammed into a sandbar that was still a bit off the island shore. The ship wouldn't budge out of the sand, and the waves began to smash what was left of the ship into pieces. The Roman soldiers wanted to kill the prisoners to stop them from swimming away and escaping. But one soldier, who wanted to spare Paul's life, stopped the others from carrying out their plan. Some prisoners jumped overboard and swam ashore, while others survived by clinging to broken pieces of ship. In the end, everyone made it safely ashore on the island of Malta.
Hello everyone, I hope you're all keeping well at home, and this sunny, warmer weather really has made me long for our camping trip, and I pray that we can do this soon. And as I ponder upon this week, I wonder, where are we in this storm of ours? How are we tracking? What stage are we in? Are we at the very beginning? Are we kind of coming through the middle of it? Or are we just starting and the worst is yet to come? Well, it's my hope and prayer that we are not at the beginning, and I pray that we are coming through the worst of it. So please continue to pray for our world, pray for healing, because it's making such a difference. And as we come through this, so many things have changed. We have changed, the world is changing. And just the basic things like greeting people. I think, the fist pumps and, the Wuhan foot shake will be kind of the norm going forward. And we have so many changes that we are adjusting to, but I think the most important change that we need to pay attention to is the change that God is doing in our lives. I think this is the most important. While we're in this lockdown, what has God been doing in this storm of ours? And this is a unique time which I don't think will be repeated in human history, in our memorable history anyways. So everyone has been going through different struggles and emotions, and I know some families have been going through things that are much more harder. And I pray that these struggles have been shaping you and me. And these struggles, if you allow them to, they will change you and shape you and develop your spiritual life. So personally for me, this isolation has caused me to reflect more. I think I've been able to listen to my mentors more deeply, and I'm paying more attention to my feelings and my anxieties and trying not to allow them to overwhelm where I am. So with this global storm, I think God has led me to the story in Acts 27. This is where Paul actually endures a real life sea storm. And he's sailing towards Italy, and he's caught up in this hurricane, and it ends up actually destroying the ship. And Paul describes very vividly in detail about his transit, about his crew, about the criminals aboard. And we also see so many things that are going on. I think first of all, we see Paul's assertive personality come through as he gives leadership. We also see his grit and his perseverance through these hardships. And we of course see his unwavering trust in God in the midst of not knowing what will happen. And of course, in hindsight, we actually see that God guides, that he protects him and the crew, and they see their way safely to Italy. But the one thing that stands out for me in this story is solidarity. Solidarity. When you have a crisis like this, like a storm, and this storm could have easily ended up in tragedy. Everyone could have perished, but somehow God used Paul to bring everyone on the same page. And this is something I want to look at. So how did it happen? What caused solidarity to happen? I believe it was Paul's witness. I believe it was his witness to a key person, Julius, the commanding Roman officer on the ship. And throughout this whole chapter, we see a lot of details, but the situation is really bad. It's quite precarious. Take a look at how Paul describes some of the things that were happening. Sailing had already become dangerous. A wind of hurricane force called the northeaster swept down from the island. The ship was caught. They passed ropes under the ship to hold it together. We took such a violent battering that the storm the next day began to cause us to throw cargo off the ship. And neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and the storm continued raging. We finally gave up all hope of being saved. They had gone a long time without food, and on the 14th night, they were still being driven across the Adriatic Sea. So you can see this wasn't just a paddle in the pond. It was a dire life and death situation for all of them. And the ship was also filled with prisoners. Julius and his soldiers were probably guarding and transferring criminals and prisoners and even slaves to another prison. And by the time we reached the end of the chapter, it becomes pure chaos. After weeks and weeks out in the ocean, they finally run the ship aground. They hit land. And finally, the people on board, they are thinking, it's now or never. Survival of the fittest. Every man for himself. And for the prisoners, this is what they thought. This was their chance. And this was their chance of jumping for freedom. So, the crew and the sailors, their job was to guide and safely deliver the passengers. But even earlier, when another crisis came up, they planned to abandon ship. In verse 30, in an attempt to escape from the ship, the sailors left the lifeboat down into the sea, pretending they were going to lower some anchors. So in a crisis like this, the human nature is preservation, self-preservation. Now, in our pandemic storm, the fear of desperation has driven some people to behave as if it was every man for himself. And sadly, we have seen the worst in some human behavior. And I think fear drives self-interest. It drives us to exploit and hoard. And now personal freedom has suddenly been expressed in terms of, this is a free country. I don't care what they say. I'm not going to stay inside anymore. I'm not going to wear a mask. I'm not going to take a vaccine. You can't tell me what to do or what not to do. So we see this happening right here, even in our city. So what do? Do we just kind of let them be? Or do we do something like enforce, martial law? And this is an option. And we've seen this in some countries. The president of the Philippines, the president has given orders for his police officers to shoot on sight anyone who violates the quarantine. And some people believe this is the way. Hardliners, they say might is right. But we all know that violence is never the answer. It just begets more violence. But we see this exactly happening in Paul's situation. The prisoners aboard, they were about to abandon ship and jump for their freedom. And notice the reaction of the soldiers in verse 42. The soldiers planned to kill the prisoners to prevent any of them from swimming away and escaping. So this was standard Roman law. As a soldier, if you were put in charge of prisoners, it was your sole responsibility to keep them in custody. But if a prisoner happened to escape from your hands, the penalty was your own life. You had to pay with your own life for the escapees. So these soldiers, they had swords drawn and ready to strike. And at that moment, Julius, the commanding officer, he makes an unexpected decision. Verse 43. The centurion Julius wanted to spare Paul's life and kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump aboard first and go get to land. The rest were there on their planks and on their pieces of the ship. In this way, everyone reached land safely. So if you look at it, this is quite an exceptional response. Julius went against standard protocol. He spared the life of not only the prisoners, he actually gave instructions how their lives could be saved. He ordered them to be unshackled and let them go towards shore. So finally, everyone reached shore, all 276 alive, safe. And through a vision from God, Paul actually had predicted that no one would perish in verse 22. Now you can say everyone was extremely lucky, which they were. You can say that they beat the odds, which they did, but it's more than luck. It's more than beating the odds. For 100% survival rate, there had to be a common purpose for everyone. There had to be a sense of solidarity to work together for the purpose of preserving life. And this, I believe, happened because God was working through Paul and into Julius's life. Julius was a centurion. He was in charge of 100 war battle experienced soldiers. And as a man of war, it is very unusual for him to go against state law and to respond in Christian love and compassion. And this was definitely the work of God working through Paul and into his life. And Julius was actually Paul's personal escort so that he could get to meet the emperor. And with this kind of relationship, we can see Paul doing what he does best. I see him prodding and poking and sharing the gospel with Julius. And I can see Paul praying for him, for his family. And because of Paul's hospitality, his heart was softened and opened to God. And we can see this being reciprocated in verse 3. The next day we landed in Sidon, and Julius, in kindness to Paul, allowed him to go to his friends so that they might provide for his needs. You know, last week in my teaching, I had reminded you at the end to do something small. Do something small and consistent every day in service of Christ. And then just trust God with those seeds to produce fruit. And right here we see Paul's seed just bringing an incredible, amazing fruit of kindness and compassion. And we always have to remember that God is at work. He is at work in your life, in my life, in a Christian life, in a non-Christian life. God is already at work. So in Christian solidarity, we need to join in with what God is already doing in this world. And in this global storm of ours, it's been terrible for so many people, but it reminds us that we need to depend on each other. There is mutual interdependence because no one can get through hardship in a vacuum. We all need each other. We all need to work with each other, to pray for each other as we are doing now. And as we struggle to serve, then together we can receive God's blessing and healing. So when you talk to your friends, when you see your coworkers and your family and they're struggling, you know, what they don't need from us is apologetics. They don't need our answers. They don't need us to explain why there's good and evil in this world. What they really need is our love. They need our Christian love and care and hospitality. And in the end, it was never about being able to explain logically what God is doing. It was never even about Christian politics or even seeing the martyr of Christians. In the end, it was always serving others with the love of Christ. I love what the late Dr. Ravi Zacharias said. He said it best. He said this: love is the greatest apologetic. It is essential. It is an essential component in reaching the whole person in a fragmented world. And we are living in quite a fragmented time. We need to show others the love of Christ. Some of you remember this novel. I'm going to show you a novel. Remember this novel? If you can't read it, it is The Lord of the Flies. This is a William Golding bestseller, and this had been for decades the standard short novel to study in high school. And it's a fictional story about a group of British boys. Some of you remember. And they end up in a plane crash, and they're on a deserted island in the middle of the Pacific. And the main characters are Ralph, Piggy, and Jack. And there's no adults around. And because there's no adults, they begin to create their own system of rules. And at the beginning, things were working out okay. But over time, you probably remember what happens, right? We see the baser human instincts coming out. The boys become violent, they become brutal, and they descend into savagery. And by the end, it was as if they become tribal warriors. And at the end of the story, the boys are rescued. But in the background, we see a wasteland. The island is burning, and 3 children are dead. And I remember the English teacher teaching us that this is the story of humanity. Humanity is selfish, and in the end, chaos will rule and we end up as savages. But here's my question. Is it true all the time? Have you wondered if this actually would happen to humanity? Does it always come down to survival of the fittest and chaos and calamity? As a Christian, I'm not 100% convinced that this is the case. I have a hopeful view of humanity. In 1965, 6 boys, they set out from Tonga on a fishing trip. They were all students from a very strict Catholic boarding school. And 6 of them, they ranged from age 13 to 16, and all of them had one main thing in common. They were just bored out of their minds. And because they were so bored, they decided to borrow a boat. Well, they actually stole it, and they decided to sail somewhere to Fiji or maybe to New Zealand. So they packed what they could. They had 2 sacks of bananas, they packed some coconuts and a small gas stove, but they didn't bring a map or a compass. And by nightfall, they made a serious mistake. They fell asleep. And a few hours later, it was the crashing of the waves which actually woke them up. And they tried to raise up the sails, but immediately the wind had torn the sails. And they tried to steer the boat with the rudder, but the rudder was broken in half. And all of a sudden, they were drifting. And they had been drifting in the ocean for 8 days. No more food, no more water. So what did they do? They had those coconut shells, and they kind of laid them out on the boat, and they collected whatever rainwater they could, and every morning each boy took a sip to survive. And finally on day 8, they saw land. They saw land, but it wasn't a tropical paradise. It wasn't Gilligan's Island. It was a rough, uninhabited rock. It was the island of Atta. And when they got to shore, they initially survived on fish and wild birds. And through the summer, it barely rained there, so they were just starved for water. But they decided that they would work together in teams of 2. And they created a very strict schedule. They had gardening duty, they had guard duty, and they had kitchen duty. And they even built a makeshift guitar out of a coconut shell and a piece of driftwood. And to keep their spirits up, at the beginning of the day and at the end of the night, they sang and they prayed. And they made a pact never to quarrel, never to fight. But sometimes they did, and they solved it by imposing strict timeouts. And one day, one of the boys, Stephen, he was hiking and he slipped and fell off a cliff, and he broke his leg. And the other boys, they carefully brought him down, and they set his leg with sticks and branches the best they could. And they even joked with him saying, "Don't worry, we'll do your chores. You can just sit there like a king." Finally, on September 11th in 1966, over a year later, Captain Warner, he stumbled upon this rock and he rescued all 6 boys. And the doctor who initially treated them was astonished at their condition. He found them all healthy. And that boy, Stephen's leg, it healed perfectly. And their families, they were completely shocked that their boys were alive. They actually had lost hope and had funerals for all of them. And the captain wrote in his memoir, he wrote this: "Peering through my binoculars, I saw a boy, naked, hair down to his shoulders, and the wild creature leapt from the cliffside into the water. And suddenly more boys followed, screaming at the top of their lungs. 'My name is Stephen!' cried in perfect English. And there were 6 of them, and we reckon they had been there for at least 15 months. By the time we arrived, the boys had set up a small commune with a food garden. They had set up a gymnasium with some strange weights. They hollowed out a tree trunk to store rainwater. And they even had a chicken pen and a permanent fire going." So this is the real Lord of the Flies. It's an amazing story of hope and survival. But it goes against our assumptions that humans always end up as savages and brutal. And this story actually shows the opposite. It shows friendship, loyalty, and solidarity. It shows us that we are actually stronger together, and we can lean on each other and trust each other in the Spirit of God. And of course, I think we'll always find examples of people acting selfishly, but that doesn't mean that this will prevail. So if you're feeling down, if you're struggling, keep this story in mind. We are the people of God, and we live as Christ lived, acting in compassion and with love. And when we do this, we're able to support each other in the storm and through the storm.